Astrocast. I'm your host, Rue. Today is Thursday, August 1st, 2024. The new moon is officially upon us. I hope you're all excited. I hope wherever you are that you have some clear skies ahead of you. I know I certainly do not. I was just opining to a good friend of mine that I believe I've only had about 4 good nights all summer so far that I've been able to image. So it's kind of been a bit of a rough one, but you know, we go through patches and it kind of is what it is. So all that being said, I am quite happy to be here. I apologize to you guys in advance. I know that the show has been slightly inconsistent over the last couple of weeks. I've been working out some kinks in my personal schedule, which has a lot to do with work. I work a lot, if you haven't figured that out, but it's all paying off quite well. So I'm very happy to have the job that I do and also be able to host this podcast. So this week we have a very interesting topic that I feel like is way overdue for a podcast episode. And what we are going to be talking about is actually based off of a post that I saw on Facebook a few days ago. One of the members of the group Astrophotography, actually it's Learning Astrophotography for Beginners is the name of the group. And I've been a member of that group for a long time now. And somebody posted a basic question, a very, beginner specific question, and they got the response that they needed, but it included a ton of jargon that the average beginner is not going to understand. And after thinking about it for a moment, I said to myself, man, I bet you a lot of people that are new to this hobby have no idea what we're talking about. And something that might seem very simple to a seasoned astrophotographer could be utterly downright confusing for a beginner. I know because I've been a beginner, as has everyone else who is an astrophotographer that listens to the show on a regular basis. So I thought it would be fun to go through astrophotography terms kind of one by one and list off, the actual definitions, what they mean, how it impacts your workflow, et cetera. And just kind of, go through all of them. And this might end up becoming like a 2-part episode, I was thinking, because I started keeping a list earlier this week in my notebook, and the list started getting really long, really quick. And I said, man, oh man, I hope that, I can fit all this into an hour-long episode, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to or not, but we'll see. We will do our best to get in as much as we can today. And if we need to, we can always, come back and do a second episode. So my bird is being quite vocal today. I don't know if you'll be hearing him. I will do my best to get him out in post, but maybe I won't. Maybe I'll leave Zach in. He seems like a honorary guest star on the Astrocast. So if you do hear the African gray, not an African gay, but an African gray speaking in the background, he loves to whistle back and forth with me. It's a game that we play. He does one part of a whistle, I do the other part. So that's kind of our thing. Anyhow, my name is Rue. Thank you for tuning into the Astrocast this week. As I just said a few moments ago, we're going to be talking about astronomy jargon. So one of the first terms that I came across when I was new to astronomy and astrophotography that really perplexed me was actually polar alignment, because I heard people say polar alignment so many times when I was brand new and I had like an alt-az only telescope, and people were talking about polar aligning their scope, and I had no idea what they meant. I even went and, started Googling it, and I couldn't really find a clear and obvious explanation as to what it meant, not to my, unseasoned eyes anyway. So I want to talk for a few moments about what polar alignment is and why we actually do it, like what purpose it serves, rather than, how you go about polar aligning your scope. So the reason that we call it polar alignment is because we are quite literally aligning our telescope or camera lens to the polar star, which is Polaris, right? So that's in the northern hemisphere, obviously. In the southern hemisphere, they have the Southern Cross and Octans 6. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I'll put it up on the screen. But anyway, so polar alignment is aligning your telescope mount to that polar star, Polaris. So anyway, I'm rambling. Why do we do this? We do this because we need to have a fixed position that the mount always knows is correct. So, you know, the Earth is rotating, and if you were to look at Polaris in the night sky and just sit there and stare at it for 3 hours straight, you would notice all of the stars around it are rotating, but Polaris appears to stay still. Now, in reality, it doesn't actually stay still. It's moving just like everything else in our universe is. We just happen to be really lucky that Polaris is in the particular spot in the sky that it is. And, you know, by being in that area, it appears to only make little tiny circles. And we actually have to use something called a polar clock if we're doing a manual polar alignment. And that'll tell us exactly where we need to align Polaris, because it's not as simple as just, you know, point your telescope at Polaris, although it can be, you know, if you want to just roughly polar align, you can certainly do that. But if you want to get a very precise polar alignment, then you need to actually bring up what's called a polar clock, and it shows you exactly where on a circle, basically, you need to place Polaris. And like picture a time clock watch face. That is what you see when you look through a polar alignment scope. And then you just basically need to adjust the mount, which means moving it left and right, up and down. Although we don't call it left and right, up and down, we call it alt and as. And once you get that positioned properly on that clock face, then you are polar aligned. So when we talk about the different types of mounts, this is an excellent segue from polar alignment to mounts. There are different types of mounts beyond these, but generally what we talk about are either alt-az mounts, which is altitude and azimuth. And those are quite literally mounts that move left and right or up and down, versus what we call an equatorial mount. And an equatorial mount is what you use in astrophotography. And the reason that we use an equatorial mount is because it can be polar aligned. And then once we have that mount properly aligned, it will literally rotate our telescope with the Earth's rotation. And that fixed point is kind of how the telescope always knows where the home spot is. And it says, you know, if I'm properly aligned to this, then I know that the Earth is going to rotate around that axis, and I can accurately track stars or nebula or galaxies or what have you, though generally we just track stars. So that is polar alignment in a nutshell. We kind of touched on mounts, which is the second topic that I have here. Like I say, equatorial mounts and go-to mounts. Go-to mounts are, well, an equatorial mount can be a go-to mount. And when we say go-to mount, what that means is basically it means it's a computerized mount that has functionality built into it that allows you to punch in the name of a star or a galaxy or a nebula, and it will literally go to that star for you. Now, how easy a go-to mount is to use has a lot of different variables. You can have a very, very easy version, which is the plate solving go-to capability. And I'll define plate solving here in a few moments. Or you can actually, if you have I'm not going to say older, but maybe a less advanced type of mount. One moment. Sorry, I had to adjust the mic stand there. If you have an alt-az mount, a lot of times you want to do what's called a 3-star alignment. And basically that means picking 3 different stars in the night sky and aligning your scope to those 3 stars one by one. And that gives your mount, your go-to mount, knowledge of exactly where it is in the night sky. Because with a mount like that, you don't need to polar align it because, again, it's only moving up or down, left and right. It's not actually rotating on that equatorial axis, which is what we call right ascension, which is another definition we're going to get to in a little bit here. But yeah, up, down, left, and right. So Those are go-to mounts and equatorial mounts in a nutshell. If I had to break it down, equatorial mounts are what we prefer to use in astrophotography. Go-to mounts, or not go-to mounts, alt-as mounts are what are mainly used in visual astronomy. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about aperture. Aperture is a word that comes up very frequently when we're discussing telescopes and camera lenses and astrophotography. And it kind of means two things. So first, literally, the aperture of a telescope or a camera lens is basically the size of the opening on the camera lens. So if you were to take, say, a telephone like this, and if you're listening to the podcast, just look at the back of your phone, and you were to measure the size of the opening of that lens, that would be your aperture. So the reason that we like to use, larger cameras and telescopes rather than just a cell phone to take photos of the night sky is because they have larger aperture. So it's able to let more light in. And if we can gather more light, we get more data and we're able to get better pictures, essentially. Now, that being said, aperture also refers to what we call the speed of the lens. So you can basically have a slow lens or a fast lens, or you can have something in between, and they will define that with an aperture value. So certain lenses will be, let's say, f2.8, we'll say, for example. That's considered to be very fast in terms of a telescope. That would be a quick camera lens, but not like an absurdly fast camera lens. And the way that the scale works is the higher the number, the slower the lens. So basically think of it like an f2 lens is going to gather a lot more light in the same amount of time that an f8 lens would. Now, we could get into a lot of different info when it comes to aperture. I actually talked about that on a different episode not too long ago, but we're not going to get too in depth on it. But anytime that you want to know what the f-stop is, there is a very simple equation that you can use, and that's basically focal length over the aperture value, as in distance, equals your f-stop. So if you have a focal length of 100 and an aperture of 20, your f-stop is 5. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Yeah, I believe that's right. Anyway, on to the next topic, and I'm going to be moving kind of quickly through these because I have so many to cover. I'm going to try to give a good explanation for each and every one of them, but again, it is a lot. So we're going to move, semi quickly through these. So next to aperture, let's talk about the histogram. So histogram is a word that you will see a lot when people are talking about their exposures and what kind of results they're getting. If you have a, very, very bright photo or a very, very dark photo that isn't really showing you what you expected to see, oftentimes if you were to post that picture, somebody would say, well, what did your histogram look like? So a histogram is basically a graph that shows you, and it kind of depends on how you have your histogram set up, but historically it shows you how much light signal is in any given photo and how much dark signal is in any given photo. So when you turn on most mirrorless or DSLR cameras, a histogram appears, and I'll put a photo of one on the screen for those of you that are watching the podcast this week. And on the left-hand side of that histogram is going to be your light or white signal. And then on the right-hand side is going to be your black or dark signal. And basically with astrophotography in a nutshell, what we're aiming for is about a fifth to a third of the way across that histogram is, generally speaking, where we try to get. Now, if you use applications like the ASI Air, for example, they will let you actually adjust the histogram on the fly. And it's basically just stretching the image, which is another word that we will talk about in a little while here. But basically, the histogram is a very, very important tool because it lets you know if you have underexposed or overexposed your photo. And the way it does that is by showing you clipping. So clipping is another one of these jargon words. So clipping essentially just means that the light is either so dark or so white in a given photo that you can't make out any details beyond that darkness. So a good example of this would be if you walked outside at night and you took a really fast shutter speed photo, let's say 1/1000th of a second while it's nighttime, that photo is going to be extremely dark. And if you saw your histogram, it would be pretty much all pushed to the left because you would only have dark data on there. And we would call that clipping the blacks because it's all black. That's all that you can see. The same thing can be said for longer exposure. So if it was daytime and I was outside on a sunny day and I took let's say a 2-second photo, it might be all white on the screen because, again, just too much light came into that sensor at during that 2-second period. And when that happens, the histogram is going to be pushed all the way to the right. Okay. And that's what we call clipping the lights or clipping the whites. And the goal here is, again, when doing regular photography, is kind of to have that histogram even across from, left to right. And it varies a little bit depending on the kind of photography that you're doing. But again, with astrophotography, we are aiming to have that histogram about 1/5 of the way down the histogram. And that's important because if you're taking like Milky Way photos, for example, very wide field shots, you want to be able to review your histogram after each one of those photos. Like if you were taking 10-second photos over and over again, before you really, get started with taking those photos, that loop that you're going to be taking all night, you'd want to make sure that you have your histogram at a good level in the photo there. So, now what's next? Let's talk about ISO, because that's kind of going hand in hand with histogram. So first of all, ISO actually stands for International Organization for Standardization. And this is a body of people who actually determine basically standards for photography. And that's really all we need to care about. But what the ISO is when it comes to cameras is actually a numerical value that we assign. And it plays a crucial role in how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light at any given time. And the way that it works is the lower your ISO is, so let's say ISO 100, the less sensitive to light your camera sensor is going to be. And then if you crank that ISO up to say 6400, it's going to be much, much more sensitive to light. And the advantage of having a lower ISO is you generally will have much lower noise in your photo than you would with a higher ISO. Higher ISO is going to show you more detail right off the bat, but it's going to come at the cost of a higher noise photo. So this is a trade-off that we always have to make in astrophotography. It's not as big of a deal if you're stacking photos together, because if we stack photos on one on top of another, that slowly reduces the amount of noise that's actually in your photo, which can be a huge help. So stacking is another term that we will get to here shortly. All right, so past ISO, let's step away from cameras for a moment and talk about light pollution. So you'll hear the phrase light pollution a lot, and it occurs to me that some people might not know what light pollution actually is. Light pollution is basically the result in our night sky of artificial lights being left on. Okay. That's the easiest way that I can put it. So all of the street lights, the car lights, the buildings with lights in the windows, all of these things contribute to the overall amount of light pollution that we have in our night sky. And unfortunately, light pollution continues to rise in the entire world year over year over year at a rate of 10 to 20% per year, depending on the location that you're living in. And if we don't do something about it within the next few years, it's going to get really, really bad in most metropolitan areas. I mean, frankly, it already is really, really bad in most metropolitan areas, but it could get so bad that you're not even able to see anything except for planets and the moons. And that's the last thing that we want. Now, the easiest way that we can measure light pollution is with something called the Bortle scale, which is something that we've talked about many, many times on the show. Briefly, John Bortle invented this scale back in the early 2000s, and it is an easy way to determine the quality of the night sky that you are looking at. So it's a scale that is 1 through 9. 1 is the best of the best, darkest skies in Chile, and 9 would be the brightest, most light polluted skies you've ever seen, like the middle of Manhattan is how I always describe it. From a 9, you'll only see the moon and planets. I can attest to that because I've actually been in Manhattan and looked up and only been able to see Jupiter and the moon. Whereas somewhere like Chile, or any Bortle one for that matter, and if you live in the northern or southern hemisphere, you can use lightpollutionmap.info to find a Bortle one sky, hopefully near you. And if you go to one of these skies, it's absolutely incredible. So if you have generally only lived in, urban or suburban areas for your entire life, and you've never made a trip to a true dark sky location, I would highly, highly encourage you to do that because it really is a life-changing experience. All right. So past that, let's see. We're going to start talking about, stacking. I've actually mentioned the word stacking a few times now, but I haven't actually defined it. So stacking refers to the process of us quite literally stacking our photos one on top of another in post-production. So basically, we will point our telescopes or cameras at the night sky, and we will take multiple photos. Let's say we take 30 photos that are 3 minutes long each, and then we're going to take those photos back and load them up on our computer, and we're literally going to stack them all on top of each other. So all of the light that is gathered throughout that entire 90-minute period is all showing in one photo. So that's basically what stacking means. All right. Sorry about that. Had to step away for just a moment. Don't mind the headphone switch. I was using the black ones, I think wirelessly, and they died, so they stopped working. So got the white ones on, but back we get to the frames. We're going to talk about the different types of frames that we see and hear about in astrophotography briefly. So you have 4 main types of frames. You have your light frames, dark frames, flat frames, and bias frames. And I'm not going to get too deep on these because, again, we have a lot of stuff to cover, but light frames are essentially your actual pictures. So when you hear somebody talk about a light frame, they're referring to an actual photograph of the stars or a nebula or a galaxy. And that's pretty much it. So that's lights in a nutshell. They can vary, obviously. You can have different exposure lengths, different ISOs, different targets, but a light is a photo, plain and simple. A dark is a type of frame that is, as the name implies, dark. So a dark frame is basically going to be putting the lens cap on your camera and then taking that same length photo that you used for the light, but taking it as a dark frame. So just with the cap on, exact same length that you did. So if you took a 3-minute light exposure, you would take a 3-minute dark exposure. And that basically helps remove sensor noise when you finally stack all of your images. And that brings us to flats. Flats are basically a kind of like a dark, but imagine white light in the place of the dark light. It's a very even flat field of light, as the name implies. And basically, a flat is essentially a 2-second or less, generally speaking, exposure over a completely white surface. So a lot of people use like a white flat panel is what they call them. And it's essentially like a sketch pad that you can set on top of your telescope. And a lot of people also use like an iPad or a tablet to take flats. But whatever you do, it's basically 2 seconds or less. And that is a flat. So bias frames are very, very short frames that are taken also with the lens cap on. And they are really just to detect and remove sensor noise. And that's pretty much it for bias frames. A lot of people don't actually use them. I would say out of these 4, in terms of importance, lights, darks, flats, and bias. Some people would say lights and flats are more important because flats also will let you remove dust from your photos if like you get dust on your sensor or on your telescope lens. If you take flats, that is going to let you remove that in post-processing. So let's see, other terms that we use, long exposure. That might be one that you hear and you might wonder, like, what does somebody mean when they say long exposure? So an exposure is anytime you take a photo. So basically anytime that the lens is gathering light and the sensor opens and closes, that is an exposure. Long exposures would be anything that is, it's not a static term necessarily. It's going to fluctuate a little bit. But generally speaking, in astrophotography, when we say long exposures, we mean, anywhere from 6 seconds to 5 minutes or more in some cases. I've got a friend who takes 20-minute exposures. But essentially, when the sensor is open on your camera, that's when it's gathering light. And however long that is open and gathering light is how long your shutter speed is. So if I take a 3-minute exposure of a nebula, that means that my camera is pointed, at the nebula, and I snap the photo, the sensor opens up and it gathers light for 3 full minutes and then closes. And that is a 3-minute long exposure. So that in a nutshell is long exposures. So let's see. CMOS sensor is a good one that you hear a lot. And you might also hear CCD sensor. These are 2 different types of sensors that are, one is extremely common in astrophotography and one is much less common these days in astrophotography. CCDs used to be the gold standard, and some people will tell you they still are the gold standard, depending on, the type of research that you're doing. CCDs are certainly more expensive to manufacture and more sensitive to light. But CMOS sensors, their big advantage is that they're very inexpensive to manufacture. So whenever the CMOS sensor was invented, years ago, and then got cheap enough to be added in to the, everyday cameras that we see in our lives and our smartphones and, obviously DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, et cetera, they became more readily available. And that is honestly why the industry started using CMOS. So they're less expensive to produce, and they use standard semiconductors and yada yada yada. Anyway, that's CMOS versus CCD. CCDs, though, they were still are more complicated to produce, and that's why people don't get them as often these days. CMOS is just much more readily available. Your modern astrophotographies like ZWO and QHY, those are going to be CMOS sensors. And the way that they work is they actually take light and then digitally convert it directly to every pixel that is on the sensor. Whereas your CMOS sensors use a different method for collecting light, where it is essentially all gathered at once. So without getting into too much detail, that's kind of CMOS versus CCD in a nutshell. All you really need to know, though, for your average hobby astrophotographer is 99 times out of 100, it's going to be a CMOS sensor that you're using. So next thing, let's say field of view or focal length. Focal length is probably what you would hear more often, but you might hear somebody say field of view. Focal length essentially refers to basically it's a specification for a camera lens, and it determines how wide of a view and how narrow of a view you may have. And it varies a little bit from there because depending on the number, you're going to have a much closer up view. So let me explain. Like the lower the number on your focal length, the wider the field of view that you're going to have. So a typical like wide field camera lens would be a 16 millimeter lens. That's a very, very wide field of view. But you wouldn't want to use a lens like that in deep space astrophotography because you want to get zoomed in more on nebulas. Like if you pointed a 16 millimeter lens, standing at your front porch, you'd get like all your neighbors and, lots of stuff in the vicinity. You'd get a whole bunch of the sky. They could be great for wide field shots of the night sky, but you wouldn't use that to capture a nebula necessarily. Whereas if you had, let's say, a 200 millimeter lens, you would be able to get a much more zoomed in view of a nebula. And with astrophotography in particular, we use at sometimes extreme focal lengths that might be 2000 millimeters or more. And with those type of focal lengths, you generally would not see them in regular photography. I would say 800 millimeters is usually about the most you'll see in a camera lens that doesn't cost $20,000 in photography. I know because I own an 800 millimeter lens from Canon, and I do not own the $20,000 1200 millimeter lens that Canon makes, but I would love to. Canon, if you'd like to send me one, ruastrocast@gmail.com. I kid because I know that ain't going to happen. But anyway, when you're doing astrophotography, you're going to have lots of different focal lengths that are possible to capture different targets. So, for example, if you wanted to capture a very wide amount of nebula, you would probably want something in the 250 to 600 millimeter range. I think 400 to 500 millimeters is probably the most popular wide field, and they call that wide field in astrophotography. I know that can be confusing because I said 16 millimeters was wide field earlier, but when we're referring to astrophotography, 400 millimeters is kind of a wide field because you're getting very large celestial objects at that focal length, whereas galaxies, which could be, hundreds of millions of light years away, those are going to be very tiny compared to nebula. And that's when you're going to need that 2000 millimeter focal length in order to capture them. All right. So that handles focal length. Let's talk about one-shot color versus mono. That's something that I see a lot of people say. You might see it referred to as OSC, like Oscar, Sam, Charlie, versus mono. So one-shot color and mono are two different types of cameras that people use in astrophotography, and there are benefits and drawbacks to both kinds. So generally speaking, your mono sensors are able to gather more data on any given type of light that you're photographing than a one-shot color sensor would. However, it's only capturing it in grayscale. So let me break this down in an easy to understand way. So your average pixel is made up of 4 subpixels is what they're called. One is red, 2 are green, and 1 is blue. And that can vary depending on the type of sensor. Some are 2 blue, 1 green, 1 red, but generally speaking, RGB is the most common sensor pixel setup that there is. There's probably a word for it, but I can't recall what it is right at this moment. Whereas mono cameras will have that same, pixel made up of 4 different subpixels, but they're all gathering that same color, essentially, is how you can think of it. And then in post, you can change that color to whatever you want. So while you gather more data with a mono camera than you do with a one-shot color, you're only able to gather one type of signal at a time. So, for example, if I was capturing a full color image in red, green, and blue with the one-shot color camera, I can take an hours long session, if you will, let's say 61-minute exposures, and then I'm going to have 1 hour of RGB integration time. If I were to use a mono camera, however, the way that I would do that is I would do 20 minutes of red, 20 minutes of green, and 20 minutes of blue. Now, would the end result be the same? Technically, you would have more data with the mono because it's gathering, 4 pixels versus 1 to 2 pixels of color at a time is kind of the best way to describe it. But you're only gathering 20 minutes of each one. And the issue that people run into there is if they don't get a lot of clear nights, like this summer, I've only gotten 4 decent nights for astrophotography. It's really hard to use a mono sensor because, you know, I want to get an hour on R, an hour on G, an hour on B, an hour on luminance, an hour on oxygen, an hour on hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. So there's pros and cons to both. I would say the vast majority of beginners are going to start with a one-shot color camera. I have 2 one-shot color cameras that are astrophotography cooled cameras. And I plan on getting a mono camera in the near future, but that's going to be when I build my observatory, which is something I've been talking about forever on this show, but I promise it will happen at some point in the near future. One thing about mono cameras, it kind of leads to our next topic, is that it's very common to use filters with them. Now, it's also very common to use filters with one-shot color cameras as well. I use filters all the time, pretty much always with my one-shot color camera, in fact. But with a mono camera, you really want to use that, or you really have to use them, because you're basically capturing different wavelengths of light with each exposure. So, like, for example, if a nebula is very rich in hydrogen, then you would want to capture that as one session, you know, like I was talking earlier about 20 minutes for red, 20 minutes for green, 20 minutes for blue. You would want to do 20 minutes for hydrogen. And the way that we can do this is with narrowband filters. So these filters basically isolate very specific wavelengths of light. So, for example, oxygen comes in at a specific wavelength and hydrogen comes in at a different specific wavelength. And if you have narrowband filters, they can filter out every other source of light except for that one specific narrow wavelength of light that oxygen exists in, hence the name narrowband filters. Now, what's cool is these days we have what's called dual narrowband filters, and those work very well with one-shot color cameras. And I'm actually going to have a separate episode in the near future where I talk about dual narrowband filters exclusively and the targets that you can get with them. And I'm kind of excited to do that because there's a lot of really great targets to do dual narrowband with. And it gives you, I guess you would say, a lot of the advantages of a mono camera in a one-shot color camera, because you're able to get those very specific wavelengths and just gather a lot more data at once, really, when you get down to it, than you would otherwise be able to, capturing what we call broadband light, which is just all of the light at once. Now, there are lots of other types of filters besides, dual narrowband filters. You also have like light pollution filters. They're made to, basically block out the very specific wavelengths of light that come from the light pollution that our cities produce. Unfortunately, these are not as effective as they once were because we switched away mostly from the sulfur dioxide lamps that street lamps used to use pretty much exclusively. If you're over the age of 30, you might remember when you were a kid, yellow street lamps that would glow at night on the sidewalks or what have you. Nowadays, most places have retrofitted LED lights. And the problem is these LED lights do not come in at any specific band. They are just broadband white light. So it's just bang, every single frequency coming out of an LED light all at once. And that makes it very, very, very difficult to filter out this type of light. And that's why light pollution, well, one of the reasons why light pollution is so terrible these days and just ruins our night skies, because it's not even just one specific wavelength of light that we're battling. It's, broadband white light. So something to think about. You also have a UV IR cut filter. A lot of cameras have these installed by default. In fact, all of your Mirrorless and DSLR cameras will come with an infrared filter built in by default. And when you do what's called astro modifying a camera, you send it away, or some people will actually do it themselves, and you actually remove that infrared filter from the camera sensor in order to gather more light from the hydrogen signal that is in nebula. And that is basically the red light that we see coming from various nebula. You think of like the Lagoon Nebula and the Heart Nebula are a couple of popular ones that are very rich in hydrogen. And if you were to use, say, a Canon DSLR camera that was not astro-modified and point it at the same target as one that is astro-modified, you're going to be able to gather a lot more of that hydrogen signal on the astro-modified version. So a lot of people will buy cameras specifically that are astro-modified for that reason. I actually did myself. When I first got into the hobby, I bought a Canon Rebel T3i that was astro modified, and I still own that camera. I use it as a backup to this day, pretty much. So something that you can do, relatively inexpensive, but keep in mind that it does. If you do it with your existing camera, you can. I think there are ways that you can like insert a clip-in UV-IR cut filter. So if you want to use it for regular photography, again, you still can, but definitely research on your specific type of camera if there are aftermarket UV-IR cut filters available for it. Because if there's not, you don't want to go and get it astro modified and then find out, dang, I can't use it for regular photography without it looking weird anymore. So yeah, keep that in mind. Just a few more topics we're going to cover today. I do think I'm going to make this a two-parter, just based on the fact that I'm looking at the list here and we still have got quite a ways to go. And I think I'm already up to like 45 minutes or so before the edit. But anyway, let's talk about dew heaters. This is a term that you will hear quite frequently. Dew heaters are essentially straps that go around your camera lens or your telescope where the lens is, and they heat up to a consistent temperature that's going to be above the ambient temperature outside and therefore above the dew point that dew forms at. Because what we don't want is for dew to start forming on our lenses while we're out at 2 o'clock in the morning doing astrophotography. Because if dew forms on the lens, then it's going to distort your image. And that's the last thing that you want. So they're not always necessary. If dew isn't forming on any given night, then you won't have to worry about them. I pretty much always bring them with me because it's better to have it, not need it, than to need it and not have it. They can be bought for about $20 on Amazon. You really don't got to spend too much to get a good dew heater. And most of them either come with a USB or a 5-volt hookup that you can plug in to most astronomy computers. All right. And the last one that I want to talk about today is one that I see get asked about all the time. And I think it's a really good one to cover. And that is backspacing. So a lot of people online will ask why they can't reach focus with their particular telescope or camera. And someone will chime in and say, is your backspace correct? Is your back focus correct? Yada, yada, yada. And if you don't know what that means, you're going to have no way of knowing whether or not it's correct. So basically what it refers to is the amount of distance that needs to be put between your image sensor and the first part of the optical train, first lens in the optical train, to reach focus. So with most telescopes and astrophotography cameras, 55 millimeters is a very common back focus amount. But it can vary a little bit. Like, for example, I've got the Rokinon 135 set up with an astrophotography camera, and that lens actually has a shorter back focus requirement. So I think it's like 44 millimeters, if I'm not mistaken. So I actually have less room to work with than I do on my big telescope for, putting in things like filter wheels, etc. But it's very easy to solve for. If you go online to like cloudynights.org, you'll be able to, find out what is it cloudynights.org. Let me check real quick. All right. Sorry. It's cloudynights.com and you should be able to search and find out what the particular back focus is for your setup. So, but essentially what it means is the space that you need to put between your camera and your telescope in order to get focus. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can put in tube rings basically that measure out to 55 millimeters if you have a 55 millimeter back focus requirement. Using things like filter wheels add space to your back focus, and then lots of other things like rotators and what have you. All those things add up. And a problem that a lot of people actually run into is they don't have enough room for back focus. I actually have run into that on my Rokinon lens, the 135, because I wanted to put a field rotator in along with a filter drawer, and I didn't have enough space. If I would have had like 3 or 4 more millimeters of back focus space, then I would have been able to fit it, but I couldn't fit it. So, I'm kind of stuck not having a rotator for now. I think there might be a way to do it at some point in the future, but I've given up on it for the time being. All right. We got enough time for a couple more that we'll get to. Let's talk about reducers and flatteners. You'll see that term reducer generally. Flattener, yes, they're out there, but less common. I think reducers are a lot more common. Essentially, you get a lot of telescopes, particularly if you have like a doublet telescope or one with less lens elements. They are more susceptible to having distortion in the corner of the image. So if you were to just attach a camera to the back of the telescope without a reducer, what you would notice is all of the stars in the corner would be stretched out and uneven because of that distortion. And to counteract that, we can add what is called a field reducer onto the back of the telescope, and it will reduce your field of view. Therefore, or I should say, hence the name. For example, I have a 560 millimeter doublet telescope by SB Boney, and I bought the 0.8 or 0.7. I think it's a 0.8 reducer, and it brings it down to 448 millimeters. It also makes the telescope a little bit faster. So we were talking about f-stops earlier and the speed of lenses. It went from f7 to f5.6 whenever I added this reducer. And that's a good thing because that means my telescope is gathering light more quickly, and I no longer have distorted stars in the corners of my view, which is not something you want. Something that we always aim for as astrophotographers is a very flat field of stars for the view that we're looking at. So let's see here. What else? Gain, noise reduction. We kind of covered that stuff earlier. I think this is probably a decent stopping point for this particular part of the episode, because I think we've been over like close to 40 different terms at this point. So let's go ahead and stop here for the moment. And I got a few other things to talk to you about, though, before we wrap it up. All right. So one other thing that I wanted to mention to you guys was I think I had talked about last week on the show, my guest starring on the episode for the Backyard Naturalist. Actually, I talked about it a few weeks ago, too. But anyway, that episode's out now. So I don't know if I mentioned it or not last week. I think I might have mentioned that it's going to be coming up, but it's out now. So if you want to go give that a listen, I will pop the link for it into the show notes so you can go check that out. It was really great. We actually talked about light pollution, how it affects us, how it affects the animals around us, and what we can do to help combat light pollution, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart because I hate light pollution. I hate it with a passion bordering on madness. So yeah, I definitely want to help eliminate light pollution if at all possible. So if you want to check that out, definitely, give that a listen. And if you like hearing about nature in general and lots of interesting scientific facts, etc. around it, I highly recommend checking out the Backyard Naturalist in general. They're good friends of the show. I photograph a lot of events for them. I'm actually their official photographer, for their podcast. So we're definitely good friends. So go ahead and give give that show a listen and give them a subscribe, and tell Debbie that Rue sent you. So briefly in astronomy news this week, it looks like the Square Kilometer Array, which is going to be the world's largest radio astronomy observation network, got its first few dishes delivered this week in China. And it's actually a combination project by lots of different countries. The UK and Australia are involved. And essentially, it's going to be a radio telescope that takes up the same amount of space as 140 soccer fields. So it's going to be an absolutely massive array of radio towers for doing radio telescope stuff. So that's really cool. I know I've always wanted to visit the very large array here in North America. I've got a couple of friends that have gone there and seen it in real life. Of course, it was made famous in the movie Contact, I believe, where she sits outside listening and playing on her laptop while sitting beside one of the giant dishes. If I remember correctly, it's been a few years since I've seen that movie. But if you haven't seen that Contact, that's an excellent movie to check out. So I would highly recommend that one. As far as a recommendation for this week, I actually have a really cool one. I actually just started listening to this book a few days ago, but I can already tell I'm going to absolutely love it. I love the author. He's done a lot of amazing work for astronomy. His name is Michio Kaku. If you haven't heard of him and you are into astronomy, you may have been living under a rock, because he's pretty much as, I'm not going to say as popular as Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he's definitely, on TV and interviews, etc., just as often, if not more often, than Neil is. So he has a book called Hyperspace, where he actually explores, if you've ever heard him talk about 10-dimension hyperspace, he actually goes into it and explains as best as you can explain in layman terms what it is when they're talking about hyperspace in 10 dimensions. So without any spoilers, I will tell you that it's actually an incredible listen. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, particularly the way that he described. So we got 4 dimensions in our world. We have obviously the 3 dimensions, up, down, left, right, side to side, that we physically move around in. And then we have time, which is a 4th dimension. And then the hypothesized 5th dimension is actually called the 4th spatial dimension. And he tells a story that he heard when he was a kid about basically scientist fish living in a pond together. And one of the scientist fish tells the other that he is hypothesizing that there is, another world outside of their own, and yada, yada, yada. You know what? I'm going to stop right there because I'm starting to give away some of the really excellent parts of the book. But you should definitely check it out. I highly, highly recommend it. It really paints a picture for you in a way that few other things have in terms of, string theory for me personally. And it is something that I've been very interested in for years, because I do think that we could be, just behind the veil of another or several other dimensions. And the math actually checks out surprisingly well. So we all know how the theory of relativity has a lot of gaps and missing spots, and we're still looking for the theory of everything. String theory's math basically computes that it would work in 10 dimensions perfectly. So it would explain, why matter doesn't just fall apart, in terms of gravity and, everything being pulled apart and yada, 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 dark matter, etc. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. Clearly, you hear me rambling here, but check it out. Michio Kaku, Hyperspace. He does not do the narration for it, but the narrator is excellent. Honestly, I don't know if I could listen to Michio for 12 hours straight talking about space, because his interviews, yeah, I don't know. Don't take that as a bad thing if you're listening to this, Michio. You have a great voice. But yeah, I'm glad you picked the commentator that you did, because he did an excellent job and he conveyed all of the information very, very well. So that was a mouthful. I feel like we covered a whole lot of info this week in a relatively short amount of time. We still have more to go over in terms of astronomy jargon terms, and we will be getting to that soon. I don't know if I'll make that next week's episode or not, because there is another thing that I really want to talk to you guys about, and I think that might be what I cover next. But I want to thank all of our Patreon members. We are up to 6 now on our Patreon society. Again, Keaton joined most recently. Thank you, Keaton. Thank you to David and everybody else that has been a member since day one. If you would like to join, you can go to patreon.com/the Astrocast and give us a shout. Carrie Hazelton, Wiley, Keaton, David, shout out to all of you guys. So thank you so much. If you would like to support, again, patreon.com/the Astrocast. We have levels at $1 and $5. All right, that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you get some clear skies. It hasn't been good for me. I've seen the ISS a lot. I guess it's been going over North Carolina and probably a lot of North America for like 2 weeks straight. We've had 2 passes every night, and one of them the other night was really good. It was magnitude -4. So, I mean, it was as bright as Venus up there going across, and it was kind of cloudy out too. So it was really cool because you were still able to see it through the clouds. I took a video of it. It was beautiful. Anytime you get a chance to see the ISS, if you're like me, you got to run outside and check it out. So big fan of doing that. If you haven't seen the ISS, because you don't know when it comes, there are a ton of good apps out there that will tell you exactly when it comes. Me personally, I'm on Android and I use an app called ISS Detector. And not only does it do the American ISS, but you can also see the Tiangong when it comes by. And you can set it up to give you notification windows. So like 10 minutes before it flies by, you'll get a notification. So that way, you know, if you're in the middle of something, you don't have to drop what you're doing right then and there and go check it out. So definitely recommend that. It also tells you the degree that it will be making the pass over in the sky, which is really important to know, because like if you got a lot of trees around your house and it's only going to be at, 18 degrees, you might not be able to see it. But like the other night, it was like a 70+ degree pass. So I definitely wanted to check that out. So definitely give that a try. ISS Detector on Android. And like I say, I had an iOS phone. There's lots of apps out there that can also tell you when the ISS is coming around. So that is going to do it for this week, my friends. I am Rue. You have been listening to the Astrocast. Thank you so much. Clear skies.